Cuba is a small island country in the Caribbean with a population of around 11 million people. For all intents and purposes, Cuba is considered a developing country or a middle-income country. However, Cuba is one of the healthiest countries in the world, ranked 30th in the Bloomberg Healthiest Country Index, rivaling life expectancy numbers of economically developed countries. But how has Cuba managed to deliver world-class healthcare while being considered an economically developing country?
So why are doctors in Cuba, a country with one of the lowest GDP per capita in the world, so special?
More than 1,100 economists, scholars and climate activists from over 60 countries signed an open letter calling for an end to a capitalist system which pursues growth at all costs.
But there's actually a strong scientific consensus among many people in ecological economics that this is the important way to go. Our existing economy doesn't benefit ordinary people.
And all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth.
Those aren't laws of nature, those are political decisions. Social, economic, and political decisions that can be made differently.
Cuba is ranked 70th in its Human Development Index and 76th in its GDP per capita. However, it is also one of the healthiest countries. The World Health Organization describes Cuba as being known around the world for its ability to train excellent doctors and nurses who then go out to help other countries in need. This is often referred to in academic circles as the Cuban health paradox. Iris Barawi, a lecturer at the Historical Institute at the University of Rostock, credits part of the success for Cuban healthcare to a concept known as degrowth. Degrowth is a school of thought that argues that our current society places too much emphasis on GDP and too little emphasis on human well-being. Degrowth argues that countries should try to reduce their economy and GDP while shifting emphasis to human well-being. Advocates for this way of thinking argue that adopting degrowth as a political, social, and economical concept will bring about many benefits. The first benefit is improved economic sustainability. When discussing economic sustainability, the ecological footprint is a commonly used metric, and this is often expressed in the form of global hectares. Ecological footprint describes the rates of consumption and production amongst humans, but in simple terms, it describes what amount of area is required to sustain an individual human being, whether that be for farming animals, agriculture, or fishing. The Global Footprint Network estimates that an individual in a low or middle income country has an ecological footprint of about 1 global hectare. That's around 2.5 football fields. The same individual in a high income country has an ecological footprint more than 6 times that amount. The report goes on to state that most countries in the world, mainly high income countries, are running on an ecological deficit, meaning that they're consuming more than they're producing. If low and middle income countries around the world consumed as much as high income countries and had as much of an ecological footprint as high income countries, we would simply not have enough space on this planet. Degrowth advocates argue that the only way to combat this ecological deficit is to gradually shrink the economies of high income countries, while at the same time increasing the economies of low and middle income countries. However, opponents of this concept argue that consumption and ecological footprint can be reduced without having to compromise on economy or GDP by developing more innovative and green technology that can extract resources in a much more efficient manner. However, in reality, more efficient technologies rarely translate to reduced consumption. Instead, what we do when we have better technology is end up consuming and extracting more resources. Ironically, developing better and more innovative technology actually ends up increasing our consumption of resources. This is a concept known as Jevons paradox. Another argument against degrowth is that industries that are harmful to our ecology, such as fossil fuels, can slowly be decoupled from economic growth, meaning they can gradually be phased out of economic growth. For example, in the 1980s, chlorofluorocarbons were widely used in products such as refrigerators and aerosol sprays, resulting in the depletion of the ozone layer. Through strong legislation and international cooperation, chlorofluorocarbons were gradually phased out of economic growth, resulting in a recovery in the ozone layer. Although we could technically decouple industries that are harmful to our environment from economic growth, based on our current trends of consumption and the ecological burden that we as humans are placing on the environment, the extent to which we need to decouple may be too large a task for us. Hence, degrowth advocates argue that degrowth may be the only viable and possible social, political, and economical movement that can reduce our ecological deficit and ensure economic growth in a sustainable way. The second benefit to degrowth is its potential in creating a more equal and equitable global society. Economic anthropologist Jason Hickel argues that our current global economy is built on a history of colonization and exploitation that favors economies in the global north to the detriment of economies in the global south. Modern-day capitalism relies on creating surplus value for products, and this can either be done by increasing the price of the product or reducing the cost of production. Reducing the cost of production often results in manual labor being outsourced to low and middle income countries, where labor wages can be drastically reduced. Our current global economic structure contributes to continued labor exploitation and child labor, amongst many other issues perpetuated by high-income countries in low and middle-income countries. While some may argue that outsourcing actually increases job opportunities and increases economic growth in low-income countries, the reality is that in such a global economy, low-income countries will always have to play catch-up to high-income countries, constantly serving the needs and overconsumption of high-income countries. Degrowth in high-income countries can allow low-income countries to have the freedom to reprioritize their own resources to cater to the needs of their own local population, allowing a more sustainable form of economic growth. Degrowth of economies in developed countries, simultaneously coupled with increasing growth of economies of developing countries, can potentially result in a convergence of both of these economies. However, implementing a degrowth-based economy in a high-income country will have negative short-term impacts and potentially longer-lasting consequences in low-income countries. For example, in 1993, there was a US child labor boycott in Bangladesh. While this was done with good intentions, around 55,000 children lost their jobs in Bangladesh, and most of them ended up in the informal sector to maintain their income. This resulted in poorer work conditions for these children. Hence, implementing degrowth-based economies in high-income countries without having proper open discussions and conversations with the people who this is really going to affect in low-income countries risks resulting in the formation of a new economic structure that carries on the same colonial trends. Implementing or adopting degrowth-based economies should always be a bottom-up approach where low-income countries have a say in dictating the extent and pace of degrowth in high-income countries. The final benefit of degrowth is the potential of better healthcare, and this brings us back to the Cuban healthcare paradox. Prior to the fall of the Soviet Union, Cuba had robust public health structures in place, with the majority of the Cubans having adequate access to primary healthcare services. Cuban GDP relied heavily on trade with other countries in the Soviet bloc. Cuba imported most of its foods, and this, coupled with nationalized food distribution schemes, resulted in the average Cuban having one of the highest caloric intakes in Latin America. The fall of the Soviet Union in 1989 resulted in the Cuban GDP falling by more than 50%. There was reduced imports of food, fuel, and medical equipment. The reduced import of food caused widespread food shortages, While the food shortages initially caused many health issues, such as nutritional disorders, it encouraged Cubans to begin growing their own food. Due to reduced imports of pesticides and fertilizers, there was an increase in organic urban farming. And this eventually received government backing in 1993. The change in the diet of an average Cuban resulted in surprisingly positive impacts on healthcare, such as reduced levels of obesity, reduced rates of diabetes, reduced risks of cardiovascular incidents, and reduced risk of strokes. The reduced fuel imports resulted in Cubans opting for alternate forms of transport, such as public transport or bicycles. This resulted in Cubans adopting a healthier lifestyle and reduced road traffic accidents as well. The reduction in import of medical equipment and specialized therapy encouraged more Cubans to join the healthcare sector, resulting in an increase in workforce. Today, the average Cuban lives up to 78 years old, just 2 years less than someone who lives in the US. While Cuba is far from perfect, it stands as an example to show that better economies does not always mean better healthcare. Sometimes less is more. So what would life in a degrowth economy look like? We would all most probably have much less income, but in exchange, we would have less time at work and more time at home. Industries like fast fashion would slowly fade away, and we would begin recycling and reusing our clothes, only buying new clothes when it's necessary. Reduction in the food industry would mean that most of us would be growing food in organic and healthier ways, reducing rates of overproduction, overconsumption, and food wastage. Our economies would be less global and more local, with our consumption in line with the amount of resources that we have and well within ecological limits. So you may ask, will degrowth solve all our problems? Probably not. But as our population approaches an ecological crisis, as inequality grows and colonial trends persist, perhaps degrowth as a concept merits some level of discussion, and for all we know, it may hold some solutions to the problems that we face today. Thank you. Do leave your comments below on what you think of degrowth as a social, political, and financial movement, and how we can implement it. If you liked this video and found it useful, please like, share, and subscribe to my channel for more content like this.